Okay. All right. So thank you very much for joining us tonight, Simon. And we're very grateful to you for writing your article in the last issue of Peace News and now for appearing here. To start off with, could you say a little bit about yourself and how you came to pacifism? What led you to that?
Yeah, thank you, Mill, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I'm honoured to be asked to speak at this event, and I very much look forward to learning a lot from everyone else here. I see there's some names, people I know, some names I recognise but don't know, and lots of names I don't know. So I think we've all got a lot to learn from each other. I became a pacifist when I was 17, which is longer ago now than I care to think, which is 28 years ago. So I joined the Peace Pledge Union then, but I had perhaps a rather basic and unformed notion of pacifism, and that came really from my abhorrence of violence and coercion as I saw it around me and in the world, and the hypocrisy I saw around that. For me personally, after that, as I became a Christian, my Christian faith and my pacifism has developed very much in a very connected way. But I am privileged to work and campaign alongside pacifists of other faiths and non-religious and even very anti-religious pacifists. And the Peace Pledge Union is a secular group, people of many religions and none. And for the last 6 years, I've been privileged to be on the staff of the PPU as campaigns manager in our small staff team. And I do that job part-time alongside other work. I teach history for the Workers' Educational Association. And for me, pacifism isn't about coming up with certainties and easy answers. It's about a starting point. It's about a starting point that rejects violence and rejects passivity, rejects submission to injustice. To be a pacifist is to be in conflict non-violently with dominant ideas. So for me, pacifism, not just for me, I think for lots of people, pacifism is about active non-violence. And in a society that wants us to think that the only alternative to surrender is violence, I think keeping alive that message of active non-violence and seeking to live it out as far as we can within a violent society that compromises us all, I think that's incredibly important.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Simon. So, as you've said, there'll be a lot of different. There's a lot of experience amongst the people who are attending this meeting, and even though we titled this British Pacifism Put to the Test, obviously you're speaking for yourself, and there are many people who are attending who would identify as British pacifists who might have different views. There's a broad spectrum, but we were taking the opportunity that you'd been willing to write this article and been willing to answer questions from your perspective. So the purpose of this meeting really is to try to put what I think is a pretty mainstream view to pacifists, and folk who are listening will also have their own answers to these questions. So my job in this meeting is to set aside my own views and my own commitment to nonviolence, and to try to voice what I think is a very widespread view of very well-meaning people, fundamentally decent people, whose views have been shaped by the mainstream media, and who just don't understand how one could have a pacifist response to what's going on. So the words that I'm going to say are not my view, but trying to put forward what I think is an accurate kind of mainstream view. So I think for a lot of folk, what I hear when I hear views being expressed is they look at what's happening in Ukraine. They're horrified by the invasion and the brutality, and they're filled with admiration for the people who are fighting back with arms. And maybe they even admire, probably lots of them do admire, the people who are going from Britain to join in that fight. And for them, that's a very natural and noble thing to do, to defend your country through arms against an armed invader. So I think that's a very common feeling around the country. And what's your reaction to that sort of pride, really, in armed self-defense?
Well, I think people who take that position, I share, there is something I share with them, in that I share the starting point of absolute horror at the atrocities that have been committed in the Russian invasion, at the invasion itself, at the bombing and killing of civilians, including children, at the apparent deliberate targeting of civilians that we've seen. And as much as I can think of other equally abhorrent wars, that doesn't in any way reduce my horror at what is going on in Ukraine. And basically anyone who starts from any starting point other than horror at what is going on is not somebody I am likely to have much in common with. In terms of what that then leads us to do, I think I want to distinguish two quite different things, because if somebody in Ukraine, in an extreme situation that I have never faced, if that person feels that in desperation they have to pick up a weapon, now that may not be something I approve of, it may not be something I encourage, but it's not for me to sit here relatively comfortably in Oxford and condemn people in desperate situations I've never faced for that would be very arrogant to sit here in a quite privileged position and condemn that, though I distinguish not condemning from encouraging. But I think it is one thing to recognize that desperate people are facing choices that they never want to have to face and that we wouldn't want them to face. It is quite another thing to sit in Britain and promote war or promote the supply of weapons into a war zone. And I can understand why many people look at that and think, well, of course, how else are they going to defend themselves? And that's because we've internalized, even pacifists like me, even a lot of people on this call, we internalize a lot of assumptions. It's quite difficult to get away from the assumptions that we're brought up with and taught, that violence is the solution to conflict, that and a sort of assumption that British troops are basically the good guys, and that, therefore British troops, if they go and help them, will be helping them to something better. And, there's a lot of talk about what we should do, what should we do in response? And we, as in individual people in Britain or group of people in Britain, is conflated with we to mean the British government or the British Armed Forces, which is a pretty dangerous distinction. I'm sure.
I totally get what you're saying, Simon, and I do want to come on to the points that you're making. But I just want to stay for a moment with this difference in kind of emotional reaction, because I think this is a big barrier for many people, most people maybe, where when they see a British soldier deserting and going to Ukraine to fight or something like that, I think a lot of people, probably the majority of people, they feel pride in that. They feel there's something noble in going to defend somebody in some other country. And there's an emotional gap between that reaction and your neither condemn nor condone. And I'm not saying there's any answer to that, but I just would seek to see if there's any more you can say about that, because I think it's sort of like you're in different worlds, and I just wonder how you can be in the same world as those people who feel admiration for the nobility of that action.
Yeah, no, I think, well, the last thing I'd want to give anyone the impression of is that I have some sort of detached, unemotional reaction. I feel an awful lot of pride in, for example, the people I'm aware of going to help in humanitarian aid, to going to support refugees. I am so proud that so many people in Britain wanted to sign up to taking refugees. And that really, you know, I think that took the government back to some extent. And I have felt a lot of pride and a lot of admiration when I've watched footage of Ukrainians with incredible courage standing in front of tanks, challenging Russian soldiers to their faces, marching through cities that are under Russian occupation, carrying on marching even when the Russian troops are firing over their heads. And the Russian peace activists I'm in touch with, some of whom have been arrested, some of whom I haven't heard back from because they're in detention. Seeing what they're doing is so moving. But I think where I differ from people who, I do understand, I really, really do understand why people feel it's good to go and fight in that situation. But I also, firstly, I don't think that's effective. You're not going to solve deep-rooted problems with bombs. It's very naive, I think, to imagine that. But also, where my pride and emotion is stirred is really in image of ordinary people standing up to violence. And while I can understand the motives of some people who want to go and fight, but if you're moved by a situation, if you're angry by an injustice, it's vital that you don't just go with the first emotion, but that you put that anger and you put that emotion into action effectively by thinking about what is the most effective thing you can do. And whatever your views of violence or non-violence, actually, a few British people turning up with guns and no knowledge of the language, culture, or history is unlikely to help anyone, except to add to the sort of feeling that the Ukrainian government wants of everybody helping them. But whether it will actually make any difference on the ground, even from a military point of view, is very questionable.
I'm just going to say to everyone that if you have thoughts or questions that occur to you while this is going on, then please do feel free to put them in the chat. I have urged Simon not to have the chat turned on because it will be distracting to him, but it's a way of us keeping track of questions. So one thing you said earlier, Simon, was about arms sales. So again, I'm sure a lot of people here in Britain feel very proud of the British government supplying arms to the Ukrainian government, and they feel proud that Britain has contributed to the anti-aircraft defenses, air defenses, which have denied Russia from having air supremacy and stuff. And so if the Ukrainians have a right to defend themselves, for a lot of people, it's sort of like it's our moral duty to assist them in doing that self-defense. So what's your response to that? I think very widespread feeling also.
Yeah, I think really there's two parts to that. So firstly, there's the whole notion of self-defense and what that means. And it makes me really sad that with the very phrase self-defense has come to mean fighting, or at least fighting back, possibly in an understandable way. But actually, if we can look back to quite some time ago, to well over 50 years ago, to the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. I wasn't around at the time. I'm 45, so it was before my time. But my understanding is that there was considerable non-violent resistance, very little violent resistance. There was people standing in front of tanks. There were people handing out Russian language leaflets to soldiers. There were people taking down all the signs except for the signs pointing to Moscow. And that, in a sense, that was defeated at a later stage because of a political trick, really. But that resistance, in some ways, held up the advance, the Russian military attack on Czechoslovakia more than a military response might have done. The Soviet commander of the troops invading Czechoslovakia predicted that he would take control of the country in 4 days because he was assuming a military response. And I do wonder if we'd had years of the Ukrainian people being trained in non-violent resistance and mass non-cooperation, what sort of self-defense we'd have had then, in that even without any training in that, even living in a very militarized society, they've still developed tactics of sitting in front of tanks and marching and handing out sunflower seeds to soldiers and whatever. If they'd actually been trained in that, how would that have gone? Because actually, while I do understand somebody picking up a weapon in a situation I've never faced, the self-defense that comes through weapons tends to be temporary, and it tends to involve killing, or at least fighting, young Russian soldiers, many of whom are conscripts. And again, I can understand people fighting them if they're attacking you. But those weapons that Britain sells to Ukraine, they're not they're not shooting Putin, they're shooting Russian teenagers. And that, again, may be understandable if that Russian teenager is trying to kill you, but it is not it is something more than just self-defense. And the second point I'd make, in terms of arms that are made in the UK, bear in mind until 2014 the UK had sold arms to Russia. If we look at arms companies based in the UK, BAE Systems and even Lockheed and others, if the UK was allied with Russia rather than Ukraine, they'd happily sell weapons to Russia instead. So in the same way that Russia is bombing Ukraine, and all the horror we feel at the Russian atrocities in Ukraine, I think many people feel the same horror at the Saudi attacks on Yemen and the Saudi atrocities in Yemen. There's a very interesting article in Peace News this month comparing those two situations. And a lot of people in Britain will be less aware of what's going on in the Saudi attacks on Yemen just because it's in the media less. I'm not saying there's something being covered up, it's just being covered less. And actually the same arms companies that are selling weapons to Ukraine and saying it's for defense are selling them to Saudi Arabia to commit similar atrocities in Yemen to what Russia is committing in Ukraine. And arms companies don't exist to defend freedom and democracy. They exist to make money from selling weapons, and therefore they profit from war. And some of you may have seen if you get the I newspaper, you may have seen an article in the I today about the massive increase in arms company profits and share prices since the invasion of Ukraine. And the journalist quotes an anonymous arms industry source saying that war is good for business. And then he says, we may not want it to be like this, but that's the world we've built. And it is, but we could build a different one. We, humanity, can choose to do things differently. And if the arms industry in Britain at the moment is helping people is giving weapons to people who feel they need them in desperation, that's a coincidence of what the arms industry is doing. That's because that's where they're making profit at the moment. And also, of course, many of these weapons are not necessarily going to desperate people. They're going to the Ukrainian government. That we know that the Azov battalion, the neo-Nazi battalion in Ukraine, has got British weapons, and the British government's acknowledged that. And once you send weapons into a war zone, you have very little control over where they go. One side captures the other side's weapons. They're used again. It is one thing for somebody in desperation to pick up a gun. It is quite another thing for somebody to calmly stand outside the situation, send weapons in, make a profit from it, and then say, oh, this is great, we're defending democracy. So I don't really have any patience with the arms industry's hypocrisy. But also on the, yeah, sorry, I've gone on about that for too long.
I totally get everything that you've said. And I'd just like to press you, which I think many people would, on, I think that I would guess that there's quite a lot of people who would say the arms industry is horrible and an evil thing. But right now, the supply of these weapons to Ukraine is a good thing coming out of bad industry. And I'm sure they would press to you to answer. Well, earlier, you were saying that people in Ukraine who pick up a weapon in the face of this brutal invasion, you wouldn't condemn what they're doing, but you would encourage it. Where would your response be to the supply of British arms to Ukraine? Are you in the same sort of territory, or would you condemn?
No, I do condemn it. I could condemn the supply of arms anywhere, and that I think, somebody sitting in BAE's office in Farnborough and selling weapons to Ukraine is not desperately worrying about what to do about a Russian soldier outside their front door.
Absolutely. Again, I'm just trying to reflect what I think a lot of people would think, which is that there are, like the Ukrainian government is desperately asking for these weapons because they're trying to defend their cities and so on. And they're desperately asking for it. And even if these horrible people in BAE headquarters or whatever are involved and they're making money out of it, there's a demand there from the people who are desperate. So again, I'm not expressing my own view. I'm just
I appreciate it.
I'm just trying to put that point of view as clearly to you as possible for them to get a clear answer of like, does it make any difference to you that there is this desperate need of this much weaker party who have been invaded, who are desperately asking for just these weapons? How does that affect your condemnation?
Yeah, sure. It does make me think about it. It does make me hesitate at times. I do. And certainly if somebody says to me that they're generally against the arms trade, but they believe it's right in this situation to supply weapons, I don't agree with them, but I think I've probably got a lot more in common with their attitudes than I might have with some people who advocate weapon supplies. However, I'm conscious of the Ukrainian government is not an innocent party in all this. The Ukrainian government has presided over a very militarized society for years. They didn't follow the option of training people in non-violent resistance and non-cooperation, and now their only response is to demand more weapons. And Zelensky's going on this PR tour, appearing in various parliaments around the world, asking for weapons. I don't know how he has time really, but I do think that what the focus on weapons undermines any attempt to increase non-violent resistance and non-cooperation, but it also detracts from the real need to push for meaningful peace talks and meaningful negotiations. And I'm not saying that's easy by any means. Of course, I wouldn't trust Vladimir Putin to tell me what day of the week it was, let alone sign an agreement. But, the non-violent resistance of activists in Russia and Ukraine and around the world can, I believe, push the parties towards meaningful peace talks. That's what we need to be emphasizing, as well as supporting humanitarian aid, as well as supporting nonviolent resistance, and all the focus on the call for weapons and Zelensky's call for weapons is not only turning our energy, but even turning the headlines and all the discussion into something that is now actually detracting from other possible responses.
We'll come to the final question, and then there'll be a little break, and then we'll move on to questions from participants, which is, I'm sure there are a lot of people whose reaction to this invasion is, thank goodness we have an army and a navy and an air force to protect us from Russians invading us as well. This really just shows how much we need a military, because if we didn't have one, the Russians or whoever would just steam in here and do the same thing to us they've just done to the Ukrainians. So, well, I'm sure that's a very widespread reaction.
Yeah.
What's your feeling about that? What's your response to that?
Well, I think it's helpful to look at the situation leading up to the invasion of Ukraine. So you've probably all heard the old Roman Empire, derived from the Roman Empire, the comment, if you want peace, prepare for war. And Roger Carr, the chairman of BAE Systems, actually, I've heard him use that phrase quite a bit. Actually, what we saw over the decade up until now is both Russia and NATO and Ukraine preparing for war. NATO countries were increasing military spending. Boris Johnson increased UK military spending by 14% in the middle of the pandemic. More NATO troops were sent to Russia's borders, including British troops in Estonia and Poland. And none of that for a minute justifies the Russian invasion. It does not provide the slightest shred of justification for the Russian invasion. But it is worth noting that the strategy of the West has been to increase military spending, has been to send in more troops, and that did not prevent the invasion of Ukraine. They prepared for war, and war was what they got. So to suggest that we'll do more of that in order to prevent future war really goes in the face of in the face of the evidence. And on the question of the notion of having armed forces if Russia invades, I mean, there's a lot to be said about the notion of armed forces to protect us, as people say, and the notion that I'm supposed to sort of identify more with British capitalists than with Russian capitalists and so on. But leaving that aside, in the unlikely event that Russian troops landed in Norfolk tomorrow morning, firstly, a lot of British military equipment is not geared for use in Britain. Tanks, for example, a lot of British tanks are designed for use in desert conditions, which won't be much use in Norfolk. And secondly, if an invading army did land in Britain, the first use of the armed forces would not be to protect ordinary people like you and me and the rest of us at this meeting. It would be to guard institutions of commercial importance or of government power. It would be to prevent anything that was politically or commercially important from being taken over. So I think the armed forces, whatever the best intentions of some of the individuals who join the armed forces as an institution are not there to protect us. They are there to protect the people with the power. And in a way, raising that point does mean we have to share our horror at the war in Ukraine, our horror at all the other wars, share the horror that many people who want a military response feel, but then speak up for why we believe a military response would make things worse. And that does mean challenging a lot of ideas that many of us have internalized. But the very last thing we should do is to condemn people who who just feel angry about the Russian invasion and just want to help and not sure what response they should be, because that should be, horror at war should always be our starting point. Otherwise, we just get into detached theorizing rather than a realistic human response.